All right. So when we do mindful reading, we're helping people to increase robust resilience skills, or we're doing it for ourselves. And not only for that anticipatory grief that comes with caregiving, but also with disenfranchised grief and complicated grief, which I'm going to say just a few words about. So if you want to know more about disenfranchised grief, if this is a new concept, the go-to guy is Ken Doka, a grief researcher who's made this his specialty. And he's easy to understand. He's written lots of articles for us regular folks. You don't have to be an academic to embrace this. But his definition is the grief that persons experience when they incur a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly mourned. So these kinds of griefs could be, a very common one actually is the death of a pet. When you lose a pet, the research shows, depending on your circumstances, you may grieve as much as you grieve the loss of a human. But at least in our culture, that's not very well understood. So while some people will send you a card or offer to sit with you or send over a meal when you lose a beloved pet, it's not uncommon to get a response like, it was just a cat, or it was just a dog. So people are made to feel shame. Their grief is disenfranchised by others because others may consider it a small grief or an unworthy grief. This happens often in the LGBTQ culture, where a couple may be deeply committed to one another, but they never married, for example, and they don't have a legal standing relationship. And so they don't feel like they can publicly mourn, or where a family of origin cuts a partner out of the mourning because they didn't approve of that spouse or partner, or their religions are different, or it can happen for so many reasons. Another example is we have a growing body of research that shows that people do in fact mourn ex-husbands and wives. They do in fact mourn miscarried babies, even though it may have been 40 years ago and everybody said, oh, you'll have another baby. And so they just shut down their mourning because it was disenfranchised at that time. Now I think people are more aware, that those losses are real losses. How do you tell somebody, though, that you're sad today because your ex-husband died? A lot of people don't want to hear that, or they think that the divorce was a cause for celebration. Well, maybe the divorce was inevitable or the right thing to do. Could have been domestic violence. There could have been addiction. Who knows what was the straw that broke the camel's back? But for most marriages, there were some good years. And when the person dies, you mourn those. So this notion of disenfranchised grief, if you can help acknowledge that in yourself or others, is really a gift, because it's very powerful, but a lot of people don't have words for it. And another kind of grief is simply called complicated grief. And complicated grief is the name that grief counselors give to those who are on a very long path. It usually means that the person has been grieving acutely for more than 2 years, and that they feel stuck, and that they have not been able to resume the activities of daily living to the degree they would like to. And so there's need for more professional help. So if you lead a grief group, or if you're clergy or Stevens minister, this is something to really keep a weather eye out for, because it takes some, savvy to recognize when a person just needs more time and when they truly are stuck or bitter or unable to carry the grief, and that's when I usually will make a referral. So everybody, in my view, all clergy, all chaplains, all Stevens ministers, all counselors, all spiritual directors should have a short list that includes a good grief counselor or two that they can refer to. And if you're doing spiritual direction, for example, you could keep seeing the person for spiritual direction while they see the grief counselor. But at a certain point, you maybe have to make a moral discernment that you can't see them for spiritual direction unless they see a grief counselor, because you've become an enabler. You don't mean to, you didn't want to, but the person has kind of pushed you into that role. And once we realize that, then ethically, of course, we need to make sure that we're not just the Band-Aid and that the other person is getting the assistance that they need. So when feelings of loss are debilitating, notice how careful I'm trying to be in my language. And when they don't improve, even after time passes, that's when you suspect complicated grief. That painful emotions are so long lasting and so severe that the griever has trouble recovering from the loss and resuming their own life. So all those things that I hope you will learn more of, and I'm going to give you a couple places where you could easily learn more about those things. What are some practical strategies then that we as people in ministry or people who are grieving can find to increase resilience? First of all, when you're doing ministry, remember that you are doing ministry to both introverts and extroverts. So I know a lot of us have knowledge of good grief support groups near us, and we will refer people to those groups, and that's a good thing. But we also know that grief support groups are more likely to work for extroverts. Now, this does not mean life of the party. This is like the psychological meaning of extroverts. People who process information externally, they talk about it, rather than introverts who need some time to process information because their processing happens internally, and then and only then are they ready to talk about it. So this is not to say that introverts can't benefit from grief groups, but they may not benefit from a grief group at first. They might need 6 months. A lot of people actually need 6 months to mourn before they benefit from a group. There's research that shows that one of the mistakes we make is to refer people to a grief group too soon, and they're not ready for it, and then they drop out after the first or second. For the first 6 months, often the most useful intervention is working one-on-one with somebody, a grief counselor, a spiritual director, or a trusted friend who can just listen. And then a grief group is often more helpful when the person's life has settled down just a little bit. Because at first people are so wrecked that they can hardly even take in what the grief group is trying to teach them, you know. So introverts, for example, may not want a grief group, and there has to be something else for them. So that's where I have tried to vet social media sites that are good, you know, where the people actually know what they're doing, the people who moderate it, and where you won't get any misinformation. So you can encourage people to participate in programs that address their issues. I think it's a good thing for people in ministry to have a short pile of various articles on the nature of grief and what is disenfranchised grief and what is complicated grief and what is anticipatory grief, to kind of send the person off with after a pastoral counseling session. Helping, just educating people about what to expect, what's normal, what isn't, grief brain, and so on, is really important. And there's a lot of good news here. Work by a man named Gregory Bonanno, Bonano, Bonanno, has shown that people are more resilient than they think they are, and they're more resilient than we think they are a lot of times, and that it helps to tell them that. So treating people like a precious flower all the time actually can be bad for them. I'm not saying not to be empathetic. I'm not saying don't be compassionate. I'm not saying don't help them. I'm sure you know that. But I am saying letting people know that they may have untapped reserves, or that they're smart and they can read, or they can figure this out, or they'll know if and when they need more help. Those kinds of things are often helpful to say. And Bonanno has done research with really big things like he's done research with people who had terrible ambiguous losses because half their family was swept away by a tsunami, and what they found in their research, that was more helpful to emphasize how to become resilient than it was to emphasize, oh, I'm so sorry, this was such a terrible tragedy. That can actually weaken some people if that's all they get. And then here are some of the social media resources that will help all of us, whether you're a griever or helping grievers. Option B, which has a strong social media presence and came out of the book titled Option B, written by a woman in her 40s who very sadly found her husband dead next to an exercise machine. He was her age too and had no warning, and they had 2 young children. And she wrote very transparently, and with the help of an expert in positive psychology, Option B. So that's a marvelous resource for all grievers, but especially younger grievers who are still working and raising kids and so on. And then a site that I've come to love and I signed up to get their occasional emails is called What's Your Grief? And they really know what they're talking about. They have an archive of articles that are so good that I often use them in the way I've described to you. I have 2 copies of 5 or 10 of them that I think are terrific and that almost any griever can benefit from, and I send them home with that person. So you don't have to compose these articles. They're already out there, very well done and ready for you to use. And all you have to do is go to the What's Your Grief website and maybe both sign up for their email, which does not flood your inbox because it's occasional, or go through their archives and save some of their articles, which are consistently good. And then the last one is the Grief Anonymous group, and they're terrific. Holy cow. They have grown. I talked to them. They've just grown in leaps and bounds since they first established a social presence. And the Grief Anonymous group has multiple groups that they're moderating. So if you're grieving the death of a pet, they have a group just for that. If you had a child die, they have a group just for that. If you lost somebody in a violent crime, they have a group for that. If you lost somebody to opioids, they have a group for that. And you can join as many of those groups as fits your need. And that's not to say you won't occasionally get a comment that seems a little off the wall, but I've monitored these groups for the whole 4 years that I was working on the book. And 9 times out of 10, the advice or the reflection that people are offering when someone posts on Grief Anonymous pages is very sound. And it's being offered by people who've been through it, and they're just kind of farther along in their grief, or they read this or that book, or they're recommending this or that resource. It's just a wealth of stuff, all free, all at your fingertips.